Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. He was 16 years old when he first worked in a campaign, and later he wrote the lines that thrilled crowds when Ted Kennedy delivered them. In all his years in major politics, Bob Shrum set a standard that lifted politics from the bland and boring to the campaign excitement and careful language that the nation deserves and that thrilled us all. So welcome.
Glad to be here. And you lifted politics from the bland and boring, too.
Well, I did it a little more local, you know. But anyway, it really, how does it feel not to be totally involved in the actual carrying out of a campaign or the politics?
Well, as I say, I've gone from running campaigns to running my mouth, commenting on them, advocating. I mean, I did a lot of Republican versus Democratic stuff during the last election. I've done more of that since then. You know, I did it for so long. And when I first met you and I came to work as Lindsay's speechwriter, was 39 years ago.
It's impossible
to
believe
and
that.
At a certain point you say, I've been around here a long time, I've been doing this, it's time to move on. And so I moved on. Now, that doesn't mean I don't care. I care passionately, and I still get involved sometime. I mean, when Senator Kennedy went back to the Democratic Convention last summer, and he was by then stricken with this fatal illness, and we worked for about a month together on the speech he was going to give, because he really wanted to get it down. And then, of course, he got sick at the convention, had to get out of a sick bed to give it. But the big thing he didn't want in there was the word die. He wanted to look to the future. So, you know, he talked about this as being a season of hope. And instead of ending with the dream shall never die, he ended with the dream lives on. He wanted to affirm where he thought the country and the party ought to go.
Did he give the whole ending of that the same speech as when he...
But it was different. It was the work begins again.
Yeah.
The hope rises anew. The dream lives on.
Yeah.
It was a way of affirming the future. And I think he saw things in Barack Obama that he had not seen in American politics since his brothers. Was very proud of the role he had played in that campaign. His greatest regret was that he couldn't have been more active on the health care issue.
In the middle. Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, he was indomitable in his illness.
Yeah.
I was down in Florida visiting him in late February, early March, and we went sailing. And he knew every shoal and every buoy in Biscayne Bay because he'd been down there for a couple of months. And we told a lot of old stories, but we also talked about what was happening in the country and what was happening on healthcare, and he knew all of it. He was on top of all of it, and I think there was the great frustration was that he couldn't be there. He couldn't be there, and I think if he had been there, this might be done already. Although I think it will get done.
So
in the end.
Let's talk about health care. What do you think is going to happen?
I think we'll get a bill. I think it won't be a perfect bill. It'll be an 85–90% bill. I think we'll get it in part because Obama, he reminds me a little of the descriptions I've read and the things I've heard about President Kennedy, whom I only met casually
when you were young.
When I was young, and I didn't really know him at all. But he had this sense of, I think, reserve and self-irony. There was always a part of him that was off in the corner, wryly observing what was going on around him. And this gave him a certain calm and a certain self-possession. And I think Obama has this sense of steadiness. He doesn't get easily rattled. In September of 2007, and you probably know this because you were involved in the Obama campaign, there were people who were, especially among his fundraisers, who were saying, you got to go out and attack Hillary. You got to make TV ads attacking Hillary Clinton, and we're too far behind, and we're never going to catch up. And this is only a few months before Iowa, and he had a conference call with him, and he said, look, I have a strategy. It's either going to work or it's not going to work, but we're going to hold to it, and I believe it's going to work. And then came the JJ dinner, the Jefferson Jackson Day dinner in Iowa, which is but it's always been critical. And for people not to understand that was where Gore went after, without mentioning his name, went after Bill Bradley by talking about stay and fight, referring to Bradley having left in the middle of the Gingrich Congress. It's where Kerry emerged against Howard Dean in 2004. So Obama goes in there, talks about the fierce urgency of now, says we need to be driven by principle, not polls. We need to think about what we believe, not triangulation. And Senator Clinton gets up and gives a speech, and she knows she needs a refrain line, and her refrain line is about taking the heat and being in the kitchen. I mean, and it just, you could just that night you could sense where
this was such a different level. It was such a different level.
And
right?
by the way, in her, I guess it's her defense, because she, after all, did pick the people who were around her. I think Hillary Clinton could have been the candidate of change last year. She would have had to have a bold health care proposal. She would have had to not be so careful and so calculated and so triangulating. Look, she only did well in the late primaries because she broke out of all of that.
Yeah, but let's just talk about back to Obama before we do this. Do you think that he really took missteps early on in this health thing? I think he deliberately did this.
I think, look, Clinton was criticized for giving the Congress a bill and saying, pass this.
Right, so he was determined to see what they came.
Right, so he let Congress have its head. But a lot of the discussion about this now reminds me of the discussion and the coverage before the passage of the stimulus bill. Right. Oh, this thing is in trouble. Right. They're not going to get enough votes. I mean, somebody wrote a story, I think it was, I don't know if it was the New York Times or the LA Times, saying it could be months before this passes, if it passes at all, and 10 days later the president signed it. So I think that it was right to let Congress do this, and it was right to do health care this year. The lesson of Ronald Reagan and of George W. Bush is, if you have one or two big things you want to get done, get them done in the first year. If you wait, if you delay, as Bill Clinton did, and I think he might say this now on health care, it goes into the second year, it goes into the midterm election year, and you tend to lose it.
So you think, so you're feeling that we're going to get it. It reminds me of the Social Security Act, right? When Roosevelt first introduced it, and then every successive year it got amended till it finally was, I think, what he basically wanted, right?
Yeah, when Senator Robert Wagner of New York played a really critical role. And Roosevelt let it actually develop in Congress till it got to the point where he could nudge it over the line. And the other thing that's interesting about it, by the way, is the Republican attacks on Social Security are very reminiscent of the Republican attacks on the Obama health care plan. Everybody was going to have to wear a dog tag, the chairman of the Republican National Committee said. The Republicans charged that the federal government would control the work lives of, I think they said 27 or 37 million Americans. They called it socialism. People compared it to what was happening in Russia. So the more things change, the more they stay the same.
How do we get such a divide between the real right and the real left? How does that happen? Have you decided how people frame their political views?
You know, there have been lots of books written about this. The influence of your parents. Sometimes you rebel against that influence. There's a book out by one of Bush's speechwriters that's pretty tough on Bush for not being conservative enough, and it turns out his parents are liberal Democrats. So, you know, sometimes people rebel. But I think this has been a historic pattern throughout American history. Whenever there are times of big change, there is a reaction, as Richard Hofstadter, the historian, said, that's often paranoid. Roosevelt elicited it. JFK elicited this very powerfully. The difference was, in a world where the media was much narrower, so that the John Birch Society could say all sorts of crazy things. President Eisenhower was a conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. You know, Kennedy,
we didn't get it all. We didn't have the cable, and we didn't. Yeah.
The news editors at the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times and NBC, ABC, and CBS decided what they were going to broadcast or report, and so that stuff never really entered the mainstream of the body politic. Today, with the atomization of communication, all of it enters the mainstream. So you can have stories that go on and on and on about things that are patently untrue, that Obama wasn't born in Hawaii. Yeah. That somehow or other they looked 47 years ahead. They concocted a birth announcement that they put on loop. It's just nuts.
Yeah. When you were talking about this, the Dallas Morning News, I think it was, had a terrible front page, didn't they? The day
they had an ad. This had an ad
from the Birch Society.
Yeah, that said "wanted for treason" with a picture of JFK the day he was killed.
It is, the vitriol is so incredible. But cable has had do you think cable's had an even greater impact on politics than television did?
I think cable, combined with the internet, is having a revolutionary impact on politics, because for a long time cable tended to reflect the mainstream as well. Fox News sort of broke that pattern, and it's more an agitprop operation than it is a news operation. Now people there will get me, and there are people there I have a lot of respect for, like Chris Wallace, but it is in many respects, and unashamedly so, I think it's the business plan that Roger Ailes has. And it's worked, which is we will be a consciously right-wing force. We'll have a few token Democrats. We'll get a big audience. We'll make a lot of money.
And MSNBC has tried to do the opposite, hasn't it?
Well, MSNBC has some real balance, though. I mean, you know, there's Keith Olbermann, but there's Joe Scarborough.
Right.
I mean, you know, Joe is a conservative. He's a moderate conservative. He's a thoughtful conservative. But there are Pat Buchanan's on there all the time.
That's
Pat
true.
and I debate each other on MSNBC. But but when you combine it with the internet and the capacity to create a story, I mean, I tell in the book the story in 2004 of Drudge putting up a big red light. Kerry had an affair with intern, just, you know, like a week before the Wisconsin primary, and
I remember
I had the unenviable task of throwing everybody out of or asking everybody to leave the room, and having to ask them, A, is this true? B, is there anything like it that's true? There wasn't. It was entirely made up, but it was a huge 24-hour, 48-hour media sensation in which Democrats were terrified that they were about to go down a road they'd been down before and didn't want to go down again. And Kerry, who'd been leading in Wisconsin by 18 points, ultimately won the primary by 6. So the power of those websites is immense, and there are no standards.
Anybody can put anything on.
Anybody can put anything on, and if you're, say, a conservative website, you can always find, out of several of the London conservative newspapers, which will print anything, you can always find a story you can put up, right.
When you talk about the book, we should talk about the book. It's No Excuses, Confessions of a Serial Campaigner.
Concessions. I'm not
Concessions.
confessing
I'm sorry,
anything.
you're right. But it really is a confession.
It's an honest, it's
It's
an
a
attempt
very
to,
honest evaluation of what you think and what you did, and some of the things that you think you may not have done correctly.
There are things I
about
did.
the other things. So the book goes from when you were a kid in California and loving all the politics, right? And you're debating and all of that early stuff. That debating experience of yours really set the course of your life.
It did, and you know,
interesting.
we moved to California when I was 8 years old, and we lived a few miles from the beach. I remember going to Venice Beach on Christmas Day, which for a kid who had been in southwestern Pennsylvania was an extraordinary experience. But all around me, surfing was just starting. Well, I'm not a particularly good athlete. In fact, you'd have to say I'm not an athlete at all.
I was going to ask you how you were a crew on Kennedy's boat.
I was never crew. I was permanent passenger.
Good.
I was declared a permanent passenger in 1979. And no, my wife was pretty good. She'd been around a sailboat, and she knows what to pull, and I don't even know the names of the things, halyards and ropes and all that stuff. So I wasn't going to become a surfer, so what I did was dive into books and dive into debate, and it did have a profound impact on my life. And I loved words, and I loved politics maybe it's weird in a 5 or 6 year old, but I did. I remember asking my parents if I could stay home from school, and they let me so I could watch Douglas MacArthur's speech to the Congress. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. I did a great speech, somewhat extreme man. Truman was right to fire him. And then I remember watching the 56th convention and seeing Kennedy spoke 3 times at that convention. He narrated a film about the Democratic Party, history of the Democratic Party. He nominated Stevenson. He gave the nominating speech. And then there was this moment, almost unprecedented, where Stevenson threw open the vice presidential nomination and said people could pick whoever they wanted. And Kennedy, to his great good fortune, barely lost to Estes Kefauver, and then came to the podium in a moment of high drama and moved to make the nomination unanimous. And I remember saying, now that's someone who could really engage my interest and energies. And it's true that as soon as the election was over, in the first Gallup poll that was taken in '57, Kennedy actually led the field for the Democratic nomination in '60.
So it's just a continuous thing. And your first real political job was at City Hall.
Yes.
Right? And then you went to Muskie, is that
Yes.
the next thing?
Yes.
So you've gone to a lot, your great regret is that you haven't worked in a winning presidential election.
Well, I did, actually, Gore.
He
won, but he
lost.
wasn't inaugurated.
Right, they took it away from him. Right.
No, and it's not a regret. It's obviously a professional regret.
Yeah.
But I think the country would have been so much better off if Gore had won in 2000. I think that John Kerry, who lost by a heartbreakingly close margin in 2004, would have been a much better president. I mean, the second Bush term was even worse than the first Bush term.
Right.
I mean, it was catastrophic for the country.
So you are essentially a very liberal, progressive person with a great center of ideals and ethics and what you want. How do you balance?
Happy to make compromises when.
Yeah. How do you do that? How do you use? I detest polls. I think I've always looked to a leader. A leader is someone who feels something and he wants to or she wants to lead, and this is it. Take it or not take it. I guess it's gotten to be such an expensive proposition that you don't want to just say that. Well, you want to try to win. Right?
Polls can be used or misused.
Yeah.
The best use of a poll is if you have a candidate who believes a certain set of things. There are probably 3, 4, or 5 different ways to express and argue for those things. And a poll can test which of those ways is going to be most effective. Poll can test whether or not telling people more or less about a candidate's personal story is going to have an impact. I think the worst way to use polls is to have them tell you what to believe or tell you what you're supposed to go out there and tell voters you believe. I think one of the problems that Bill Clinton had was after the trauma of the '94 midterm election, when Dick Morris became his principal political guru, and other people for whom I have great respect, like Stan Greenberg and James Carville, were kind of marginalized at that point. They came up with this strategy of stealing Republican ideas, walking away from health care, and proposing what I call small bites ideas, school uniforms.
Yeah.
And at some level, I guess it worked, although you could never persuade me. Bill Clinton got 49% of the vote. He desperately wanted 50. He beat Dole 49-42. But you could never persuade me that if he had run for what he believed at a deeper level, that he wouldn't have beaten Dole. He would have beaten Dole.
Of course he was.
What was driving that election was the economy was doing so much better.
Yeah.
And the consequence of that was that Clinton had a second term, and the Republicans contributed to this, or the president did too, with the Monica scandal. Clinton had a second term where there weren't a lot of great achievements. He almost got the Middle East peace process, which would have been historic, but it was he got reelected without an agenda or a mandate. And I think that's when you misuse polls.
Well, how did he get elected the first time? Was it his youth and attraction?
Well, he got elected partly because
it
was a three-way race.
Right.
Don't forget, he got elected with about 43% of the vote, and Ross Perot got about 19% of the vote. There's dispute about this, and a lot of Clinton people like to believe that a majority of the Perot votes would have gone to Clinton. I don't really believe that. I think a lot of them would have gone to, probably a majority of them would have gone to Bush. So that's how he got elected, but he ran a very effective campaign.
He did.
And Al Gore played a huge role in that campaign.
It wasn't also very difficult because Dole was very unexciting.
Well, 96, the re-election, Dole was,
Oh, that was 96, yeah.
By then the economy was just booming. And I think the president very much wanted to get, I know he did, very much wanted to get 50% of the vote, be the first Democrat in a long time who had done that, 20 years. And he missed it. But people pulled back a little at the end. But I think in some ways that's because he didn't energize that electorate in 96.
How many, you also advised or consulted or was the what do you call it?
Strategist.
for
Everybody's
a
a strategist.
for a lot of Senate campaigns and some other campaigns, and abroad also. How many of the candidates really had that core of beliefs?
Most.
Most of them?
It doesn't mean that some aren't afraid of it and some don't kind of want to shy away from it. I tend, after the years I spent, to defend politicians. I think, first of all, there's a real sacrifice in doing it. Most people don't actually want to get up in the morning and open the paper and read something terrible about themselves, which is an inevitable price you pay if you go in. Secondly, most of them really care about the country and care about the society. Now, there are other pressures. They got to raise money. So, you know, you have people, all these special interests who supply money. I mean, I remember some group once came to see Kennedy, and they said what they wanted was a hearing, and he got to the end of the discussion. He said, well, now you've had your hearing, and of course I'm voting against you. But that's not
that's
not
Kennedy,
all that common.
Yeah.
Look, you were in politics. I think a lot of these folks, and you saw this in the 60s with Robert Kennedy. I mean, a lot of these folks have very deep beliefs and are willing to really go out and put themselves on the line.
Does it mean that they have an excessive ego?
I think no one runs for president, and probably no one runs for Senate or maybe even Congress or governor, certainly, without some sense of ambition.
I think.
And some belief that, you know, that and a certain amount of egotism. But the question is whether you have a balance to that, whether you have the capacity to laugh at yourself, whether you have a sense of perspective. I think Obama has a sense of perspective.
And Kennedy certainly had.
Yeah, and Kennedy, you know, and Teddy, I mean, Teddy had this line he used to use in the 70s and early 80s. He said, "I don't mind not being president, I just mind that someone else is." And it was
great.
But it told you a lot about him. I mean, he had a line, you know, about taking issues seriously but never taking yourself too seriously. And I think we get in trouble when we have presidents who are so absolutely convinced they're right that they don't listen to alternative points of view, who aren't willing to compromise. I mean, you said earlier that I thank you for the compliment, that I have a core of beliefs, and I think I do. But I learned from some of the best people I work for that sometimes you have to get 75% of what you want. And that to try to be a purist on these issues means that maybe you don't get anything at all. There's the health care bill. If I were writing a health care bill for America, it would be single payer. Do I think that has any chance to pass? No. So you're going to get something less than that.
But there is a role to sticking to the principle before you compromise to a certain point.
Oh, well,
and then knowing, right?
There's also a role for agitating. I mean,
it's very important.
It's the story about both JFK and LBJ telling Martin Luther King. This is before LBJ got mad at him for being against the Vietnam War. But you stay out there. You keep pushing me. Keep pushing me. Keep pushing me. Because you want people to create the atmosphere in which you can actually move on some of these issues.
And it's a very interesting process, but you have to have a real instinct for that, don't you?
Yeah. And you have to understand that people can agree with you, support you, like you, and they're still going to push, and they're still going to say you're too slow. And that at times you can harness that and use it to move the process forward.
Do you find that most of the candidates also have this sense of humor and
that's probably
ability?
Probably less common than because look, most people don't have a great spontaneous sense of humor, and this is not ideological. Ronald Reagan had a great sense of humor. I mean, and
they're under a lot of stress, so then they always worry about it, right?
When I was introduced to Reagan during the administration. They started to explain who I was. He said, "Oh, I know who he is." He says, he writes these speeches. He said, they kick the H out of me. He said, but they're really good. Now, how can you not like somebody like that?
You can't.
I mean, you can disagree with his politics. And that's part of what we've lost. The fact that a Reagan could sit down with Teddy Kennedy or Tip O'Neill.
And a charm.
And that after hours they could have had a huge fight during the day on sanctions on South Africa, which a fight that Kennedy ultimately won. But afterwards, they could sit down and they could have a civil relationship.
Do you think reformers fall into that category? I always did. I always thought they were taking the humor. This is out of local politics.
Yeah.
You know, we were really serious and just never forgiving or understanding or anything else.
Well, the campaign the presidential campaign you were so deeply involved in 1968, I never understood the people on the left who were so angry at Robert Kennedy and said, look, McCarthy got in first, so you had to be for McCarthy. Right. Well, McCarthy wasn't going to get nominated. There wasn't a chance in the world he was going to get nominated. So if you wanted to stop the war in Vietnam or make some progress on civil rights, you had to be for Bobby. I mean, it wasn't hard.
No, it wasn't.
I mean, Dick Goodwin, who had been originally with McCarthy, figured that out and moved to Bobby. My wife had originally been McCarthy's deputy national press secretary, and she left during the Wisconsin primary. But and McCarthy deserved a place of honor for having dared to challenge Johnson in the first place. But the fundamental reality was that Dick Daley and a whole set of people had a lot of power in the Democratic Party were never going to nominate him.
So are you going to write another book?
I'm pleased that my editors want me to, so I think I probably will, but I have to settle on what it is.
Well, this book is so filled with wonderful stories and humor and everything else, and I hope people read it. I love talking to you. I hope you'll come back again, and we can discuss some more. We have to actually talk more about Obama, I think.
Okay, great.
So
I'd love
to. Okay,
yes, great.
Very good. Thank
Thanks,
you very
Ronnie.
much, Bob Shrum. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.